Getting into part 3, we are going to start dismantling mechanical connections. So, my go-to mechanic has been really busy. So I was intending to take him the truck, but he's weeks away from being able to do anything to the truck. So he says to me that he doesn't have room and takes up real estate waiting for parts. Could take weeks and months even before he gets it running. So I decided, well, the best thing I can do is pull the motor and bring him the motor. If he doesn't have room, then he could take apart the motor. And then, so that's what I did. I planned on taking out the motor and bringing the motor. So once I had the motor out, I went and saw him, and he still says he's weeks away. And then he tells me I should take the head off and bring the head to this guy and do all of this stuff and go order these parts and all that. But that requires a lot of skills and knowledge that I don't have, and I don't have time to learn about such things. I got to get this thing running. So then I started going around to the shops and, show them a picture. Here, I got this motor. Can you fix it? And they were all like, why did you take the motor out? So, well, just because everybody seemed to be having trouble with real estate and parking the truck and waiting for parts and so on. So, went to a few places. They're all weeks away from being able to help me out. So I went to plan B. I went to a junkyard and I said, well, you got any motors like this? And they said, no, but go see this guy or give this guy a call. 99 Truck Parts in Surrey, BC. That's what he does, commercial vehicles, small and large. So I called him, sent him an email actually, and then he called me back about half an hour later and he says, no, I don't have a 4HK1 motor in stock, but you could talk to this guy, Suki, at Dillon Automotive in Surrey. So I gave Suki a call, and he's like, what do you got? And I says, well, I have this W4500, blown head gasket, bad injectors, so on. He says, yeah, we can fix it. He says, send me the truck. I said, well, I took the motor out. He says, why'd you take the motor out? I says, because everybody was giving me the don't got room for the truck story, so I just took the motor out, and now I'm looking for somebody to take the motor and fix it. So he's like, okay. So I brought him the motor, and when I got to his shop, his guys were like, why'd you take the motor out? So, same old story. Told them what was happening. So anyway, they have the motor now. They've had it for about a week, and I'll probably hear from them this week. It's May 3rd. So that's when I'll know more, where I'm standing exactly. They are going to send the injectors out to be tested, because if they're good injectors, they can be rebuilt, refurbished. I think Bosch makes good injectors. They can be fixed. Injectors are $700 a piece for good ones. You can shop around, maybe get a better deal, but probably not a better deal on good ones. I'd rather just have good parts than break down. So we'll see how that works out. And then he's thinking maybe the head gasket is not blown. These 4HK1s are notoriously bad for oil cooler failures, which will give you the impression that you have a blown head gasket. So, geez, that would be okay, because that would knock about $3,000 off my head gasket job. So that would be nice. We'll see what happens with that. So this is where I'm at now. I'm just working my way around, disconnecting that last starter ground connection, and working my way around the engine. This is where things start to get dirty, messy, greasy, and more likely to break bolts. Like I say, I been putting lots of penetrating oil to everything over the last couple of weeks. Here's one of those stud bolts. So there's a stud going through a piece of rubber with a nut on each end. You never bolt steel to steel when you're going from one component to another. So the engine vibrates and the frame doesn't at the same rate, are in the same way, so you have rubber between the two different components. So you wouldn't want to break those studs. That would be an easy fix, but still, why risk breaking anything? And up front now, I'm on the radiator plate supports. There it is there. I'm working on those. And they were particularly rusty, even though I'd been putting the penetrating oil to them for a while. And rather than watch you watching me do that, I showed you how I put it back together. The reason I took all of this stuff apart on the front end was so that I could take the motor out with the rad, and the tranny cooler was in the way. And actually I had to loosen these hoses here. You'll see in a minute, clamps. To get that plate out, I had to take some other hoses apart. Hose retainers, clamps, whatever you want to call them. So I can put this back together. Another reason for taking these off, because I'm pulling the motor with the rad, when I break it from the transmission, I have to come forward maybe 4 inches. And if those studs are hooked to the rad, same with the engine mounts, there's studs that stick out. So I had to pull anything off with a stud so I could come forward with the engine and not get stuck anywhere. So all of this came apart just so I could take out the motor with the rad on it. You notice I put lots of penetrating oil on. That's still the same penetrating oil, acetone and synthetic transmission fluid, 50-50 mix. Works like a charm. Saves a lot of money compared to buying cans of penetrating oil. And I've seen tests, especially from Chris Fixit. He's never had anything perform that good in his tests, so I'm going to stick with somebody who knows what he's doing. So here are, you'll notice the bolts have flanges on them, and the nuts have flanges on them. So it's almost like the bolt has a washer that's part of it, and the nut has a washer that's part of the nut, one piece. They have knurls or grooves on the bottom that bind to the surface when you tighten them. And they hold like nobody's business. Like, they're better than lock nuts. They're better than, well, they are a lock nut, but they're better than lock washers or nylocks. They're just awesome. And taking them apart, they're tougher to take apart than something with a lock washer. I've never seen them come loose on any kind of equipment. Here you see I'm working on the plate, going back and forth. So I loosen the nut off of the plate for the radiator mount until it gets tight. Then I put it back on, and then I take it back off till it gets tight. Then I put it back on, take it back off, back and forth, putting it off, putting it on, taking it off, just to clear the threads without snapping the studs. I don't want to break any of the studs. Those plates would be easy to fix. I fixed one for the cowling on the back of the cab. I'll make a video of that. Simple thing to fix. Drill a hole, put a bolt through instead, because you have access. I think these plates are more of a convenience for the assembly in the factory. There's a transmission cooler hanging down there. So now I'm going to put that back together. So the hose that I just flipped over, it's got a metal spigot on the end of the hose. It's part of the hose. You don't want to damage those taking them off. Here I'm adding, those nuts are welded to the frame where the transmission cooler bolts to. So I'm adding some penetrating oil before I put them back together. So back to the hose. When you loosen those hoses, you want to hold the spigot with your plumber's pliers, or they're also called water pump pliers, while you turn the nut. And you'll see in a minute coming up here. So if you just try and spin the nut off, you're going to snap the spigot part of the hose, and then you got to replace that hose. It's a patience thing. You see where the rad would have smacked into that little rad. They're so close together. That rad actually connects to the regular rad. Here's that little nut and spigot pipe I'm talking about. You want to keep that nice and loose and moving. So here's a broken clamp. You'll see in a minute where it came from. It's just a light aluminum clamp as part of the transmission radiator. Holds the hose from flopping around. So I'm in a boneyard, a graveyard of trucks, commercial vehicles. It's really noisy, which is another reason you don't have the original audio. It's really trucks coming and going and beeping and all kinds of noises. So I went and got a clamp off one of the dead trucks. I'm going to reshape it and reform it to use as a clamp. Make a new clamp for my hose. Clamps tend to be malleable, so the metal fatigue won't crack it or break it while you're bending it. Easy to shape. Not any heavier than it needs to be. There you go, I got it all shape. And now I'm going to vice grip it in place and drill the hole in place so everything's lined up. And I'll get my pop rivet gun out and get a pop rivet in there, be nice and snug. And I bolt my hose back in place. So a little fix there. I add a zap strap. I would have liked 2 pop rivets on something like that, but I couldn't. There's no room, so I'm adding this heavy duty zap strap in there to tighten that right up. I just say about that Milwaukee rivet gun you just saw with the XC4 battery in it. That'll last you 6 hours of popping 1/8 stainless steel rivets. We did a job in 2021 on some stainless steel sheet metal in a place that grows the food for the mushroom farms. And we did like thousands and thousands of 1/8 stainless steel rivets with 2 of those Milwaukee rivet guns. And no problems whatsoever. Didn't wear any out. We'd go for about 6 hours on one of them 4 XC4 batteries. Just a super tool. You never could have done that by hand. You would have just killed your hands, and you would have burned through those typical old-fashioned hand crank rivet guns. They just won't handle that kind of. They're good for aluminum, those old style ones, and not all day long, and not thousands of rivets. But they wouldn't have handled the stainless for very long. We probably would have went through a couple of dozen of the old style rivet guns, or we would have had to go to air, set up a compressor and get an air rivet gun. And that's just noisy. Really liked the cordless one. It really did the job. Here's a retainer, a zap strap that was holding the wiring harness in place, but it's a zap strap that goes through a zap strap holder. So I managed to pull the old zap strap out and reuse the holder with one of my zap straps I had handy there. You want to make sure you put all of these ratchet straps and retainers back. You don't want your hoses flopping around, your wiring harness flopping around. Yeah, it's got to move. You don't want things to be like super tight so there's no play in them, but you don't want them flopping around either. And I tried to put everything back to where it was in the same grooves or the same marks where it was fastened before, like this hose right here. I'm putting that clamp right back where it was. And I'm also making sure it's pointed forward. I'm sitting where the motor is going to be. So if I had to loosen that clamp in the future and my screwdriver is pointed towards me, I wouldn't be able to use that tool. It would just be really hard to get at the clamp. So here I am putting another one of those radiator plate clamps down. It gives you a good idea how it looks from the other view. That would be easy fix if I'd broke that stud, but you know, a little patience. I didn't have to deal with that. Here's another one of those rubber mounts with the stud that goes all the way through. One side bolts to the frame bracket, the other one bolts to the pipe bracket. So you'll notice a little bit of rust. The pipe's not looking too healthy. I noticed another guy was having trouble with his engine running rough, and he couldn't figure it out for the longest time. Then he found out that pipe had rusted right through. So I planned on driving by a muffler shop one day when I got the truck running, and if they have the pipe in stock of the same gauge with the same outside diameter in stainless, I'll just pop that one off, and he could bend one up in probably half an hour, and I'll install a stainless one with some new clamps, so I won't have any trouble in the future. That's probably less than $100 fix. Save you time and trouble. I'm underneath now. I'm working on the motor mounts and the muffler exhaust pipe connections to the exhaust manifold. Those are the most common to break. Like, there's 3 studs on the manifold, and there's 3 nuts that go through a flange on your tailpipe. And if you're going to break 1 or 2 studs, those are the ones. I've been greasing them up for a while with the penetrating oil for a couple of weeks. And so I managed to get 2 off, but then the third, the nut stripped. So I said, well, okay, you could spend hours trying to deal with that. You could, if it's a good situation and you're a welder and you have the welding machine with you, you can weld a new nut onto the old nut so you have a better grip. But I'd rather not do that where it is with all the oil and there's no room to work. You're welding. I'm not a welder, but a welder wouldn't be happy to work under there and be looking up with everything falling in his face while he's trying to tack a nut on that nut. So I just kind of walked away from that one. Think about it. I know there's some tools available to deal with that sort of thing now. So I moved on to the motor mounts. There's 4 motor mount bolts, and I stripped all 4 of those nuts. And you'll notice, I'll show you a picture in a while, they're flange nuts, so they were really bound in place. The vibration they were pretty much part of the frame, and I had been putting the penetrating oil to them too. So normally you would there's one in the bottom right center, the one nut you can see, that's actually the head of the bolt. The nut's on the other side. I'm working at it from underneath. That was a top view. You can spend hours trying to get those things off if you can't weld a nut on there, if you don't have that ability or capability. You'll find you're trying to use a metric socket or a standard socket on a metric bolt or nut, and it'll just drive you crazy. So I ended up going down to KMS Tools, and I bought the most wonderful little thing I wish I'd discovered a few decades ago. They probably didn't have them, but it's awesome. And it's a stripped nut or stripped bolt removal socket, and it looks kind of like a 8-leaf clover, the profile inside the socket. And so I got those, and I hammered it on, tapped it on to the nut, and put my impact on there, and they spun right off. The last of the exhaust manifold nuts and all 4 of the engine mount nuts just came off like nobody's business. There's a picture of the gear wrench socket right there. It's a 3/8 drive, but I used a 3/4 inch socket over top of that socket with my 1/2 inch impact,